Aleister Kunzler was just 2 years old, full of laughter and energy, his twin sister Lara always by his side. But on one fateful night in December 2023, their lives were torn apart in a way no child should ever have to endure. Aleister was brutally murdered, and his sister Lara, left for dead, clung to life as she fought against devastating injuries that would change her forever. The man who inflicted this unspeakable violence? Jonathan Allen Dunn, a man the Kunzler family trusted, someone they welcomed into their home, treated as a friend, and asked to care for their children. But on that night, Dunn's actions shattered that trust and revealed the unimaginable truth behind his dark motives. But before we begin, I just want to take a moment to thank you, my incredible viewers and subscribers. Your likes, shares, and thoughtful comments don't just support this channel, they help keep these stories alive. If you're new here, welcome. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and become part of this growing community that believes every story deserves to be told and no victim should ever be forgotten. Now let's get into it. The Kunzler family had always lived a quiet life in Roy, Utah. Justin and Brittany Kunzler, high school sweethearts, had built a home filled with love and dreams. Their world became even brighter with the arrival of twins, Aleister and Lara, born on February 19, 2021. From the start, Aleister and Lara were inseparable. Aleister, the more outgoing of the two, had an infectious energy that filled every room. He adored his favorite cartoon, Teen Titans Go, and his beloved plush toy, Puss in Boots. He was a daddy's boy, always snuggling close to Justin while they watched movies together. His blue, starry blanket was his comfort, a symbol of the warmth his parents gave him. Lara, his twin sister, was quieter, but her bond with Aleister was unbreakable. She was steady, while Aleister was the spark. Together they made the perfect pair. The Kunzlers cherished these simple moments, weekends filled with laughter, finger painting, and playing with blocks. Justin, a carpenter, would bring home wood scraps for the twins to build with, pretending to knock down their creations. These were the moments that made life feel complete. Aleister's laughter resounded through the house as he and Lara played in their red wagon, joyfully waving at neighbors. Their world was filled with endless potential, and their family was their everything. But in the blink of an eye, everything was about to change. A trusted family friend, Jonathan Dunn, was about to destroy it all. What was meant to be a typical night of babysitting would soon become a nightmare. The trust they placed in Dunn would be shattered in a way no one could have ever imagined. Jonathan Dunn seemed like the kind of person anyone would trust. To the Kunzler family, he wasn't just a babysitter, he was a long-time family friend, someone they had welcomed into their home, shared meals with, and relied on when they needed help. They knew him as patient, dependable, the kind of person who would never betray their trust. But underneath that friendly exterior, Jonathan Dunn was hiding a terrifying secret. Just a few years before, in 2017, he had been convicted of child abuse after violently breaking a 2-year-old's arm. He'd left the child with bruises, and the incident landed him in prison. This was no small crime. It was a clear warning sign, but the system failed to keep track of him, and the Kunzler family had no idea. Dunn had done his time, been released, and on the surface seemed like he'd turned his life around. He was back in the community, working odd jobs, and continuing to present himself as a trusted friend, someone who was safe to be around children. It was this facade that allowed him to slip back into the lives of families like the Kunzlers, who thought nothing of it when they asked him to babysit. The Kunzler family, in their innocence, had no reason to question his reliability or his intentions. Dunn had babysat for other families in the neighborhood, was known by the community as kind-hearted, and presented himself as the kind of person you'd call to watch your kids when you needed a break. To Justin and Brittany, he was just a helping hand, a trusted face they thought they could count on. But the truth was, beneath the mask of normalcy, there was something much darker lurking. And when the evening of December 20, 2023 came, it would reveal the horrifying consequences of that misplaced trust. So, on the evening of December 20, 2023, Justin and Brittany Kunzler left their home, trusting their family friend Jonathan Dunn to care for their 2-year-old twins, Aleister and Lara. Jonathan Dunn arrived at the family's home around 6 p.m., his usual self, smiling and eager to spend time with the children. Aleister and Lara were thrilled. To them, he wasn't just a babysitter. He was Uncle John, someone they trusted, someone who had always been there. Dinner was served, and the kids, as excited as ever, chattered away between bites, oblivious to the horror that would unfold just hours later. By 7:30, everything seemed perfectly normal. Dunn had begun his babysitting duties, reading stories to the twins, comforting them before bed. The laughter, the familiarity, it all painted a picture of a peaceful evening. The twins, cozy in their pajamas, snuggled into their beds, their world still full of innocence. Dunn kissed them goodnight, and the house settled into a calm quiet, with the evening seemingly going as expected. But by 9 p.m. the mood shifted. Aleister and Lara had fallen asleep, and Dunn's frustration, the cracks in his carefully constructed persona, started to show. His demeanor turned cold, his patience waning. What started as playful moments, small gestures of control, quickly escalated. His anger, the darkness that had always been there, began to rise. No one could have anticipated the shift that would unfold next. However, by 10:30 p.m., the violence erupted. Dunn, in a fit of rage, slammed Aleister's small head against the hard door frame. The sound echoed through the house, a horrifying collision of bone and force. Aleister went limp, his body giving way to the brutal assault. But Dunn didn't stop there. He continued, pushing further, escalating the violence with a cruelty that would forever haunt the Kunzler family. The same child he had once played with, trusted in his care, was now nothing more than a target of his uncontrollable rage. Then by 11 p.m., the severity of the situation was clear, but instead of immediately calling for help, Dunn panicked. He knew what he had done, and he knew the consequences would be dire, but instead of acting to save the children, he chose to cover his tracks. Dunn administered Tylenol and cough syrup, perhaps hoping the medication would mask their pain, delay the symptoms, or make them less likely to cry out. He delayed. He lied to himself about the consequences, but the truth was inescapable. It wasn't until 12 a.m., after what must have felt like an eternity, that Dunn finally called 911, but by then it was far too late. Aleister, his body already ravaged by blunt force trauma and his injuries hidden behind the false comfort of medication, was beyond saving. The life that had once brought so much light to the Kunzler family was gone, and the nightmare that Jonathan Dunn had unleashed had already sealed their fate. The 911 call would come too late, the damage irreversible, and the memories of that night would haunt them forever. But the brutality that Aleister and Lara endured didn't end when Jonathan Dunn finally made the fateful 911 call. The damage had already been done. Aleister's autopsy revealed the unimaginable: severe blunt force trauma, his skull shattered, his internal organs crushed from the force of repeated strikes. His death was a direct result of the violence Dunn had unleashed in his rage, a violence so relentless it could not be masked. But the horror didn't stop there. The autopsy also confirmed what was feared but never spoken: signs of sexual abuse. This grim finding wasn't just a tragic consequence of Dunn's escalating cruelty, it was proof that the evil he inflicted on these children went beyond the physical violence he'd confessed to. Every inch of Aleister's tiny body had borne the weight of a trusted family friend's malice. Then there was Lara. She survived, but the trauma left deep scars, both visible and invisible. She had a brain bleed, a life-threatening injury that required immediate surgery. But it wasn't just that. Her small body was covered in bruises, fractures marking her tiny limbs. Doctors noted the injuries weren't a single event of violence, they were repeated. These weren't injuries inflicted in a moment of rage, they were the result of ongoing abuse, a torment that had been building up over time. And in the midst of all of this, Dunn did what only a man without a shred of humanity could do. He delayed the call for help. Instead of rushing to save the children he had so cruelly harmed, he gave them medication, Tylenol, cough syrup, thinking it would cover up the injuries he had inflicted. Every minute, every second he wasted compounded the tragedy, leaving the children to suffer in silence, their lives hanging by a thread while he tried to erase his tracks. By the time help arrived, it was already too late for Aleister. His tiny body, battered beyond repair, was no longer fighting. And Lara? She was left to fight for her life in a way no child should ever have to. When law enforcement arrived at the Kler home, what they saw was a scene that didn't add up. The house, once filled with the laughter of children, was now a place of chaos and horror. Toys were scattered across the floor, a dinner half-eaten, a grim reminder of the normalcy that had been shattered. Jonathan Dunn, the man trusted to care for the children, was frantic, his panic intense as he tried to explain away the gruesome scene. But the bloodstains that marked the carpet told a different story, one that didn't match his claims of accidental falls. The furniture was displaced, and the evidence... Investigators knew immediately something was off. They began to piece together the details with a forensic eye. Tylenol and cough syrup were found at the scene, items that Dunn had given to the children in an attempt to mask their pain. But the real shock came when a foam mallet was discovered. The mallet, a simple toy in any other context, was now linked to a crime so brutal it left investigators stunned. The more they looked, the clearer it became. Dunn's story didn't just fall apart, it unraveled. At first, Dunn stuck to his narrative, claiming the injuries were the result of an accident. He tried to maintain that the children had fallen, that this was all just a tragic mishap, but the cracks in his story began to show. His explanations didn't align with the physical evidence. The inconsistencies were glaring, and when the investigators pushed further, they cracked open his version of events, forcing him to confront the truth. That's when Dunn's confession came, slowly at first, then with a chilling clarity. He admitted to what he had done. He confessed to using a toy gun as a weapon, to striking the children with a foam mallet, and to using his own hands to inflict pain on the twins. These weren't spur-of-the-moment actions. This wasn't a loss of control. What Dunn had done was deliberate, calculated. He had planned every violent step. Each act of cruelty was not a mistake, but a choice. And in that moment, when his own words revealed the depth of his malice, it became painfully clear. The man the Kler family had trusted was a predator. The trial against Jonathan Dunn unfolded in a way that left little room for doubt. The prosecution came prepared, laying out a case so strong it could not be ignored. They presented forensic evidence that painted a vivid, haunting picture of the brutal abuse Aleister and Lara had endured. The autopsy reports were blunt, describing in graphic detail the extent of the violence Dunn had inflicted. The injuries weren't just the result of a single act of rage. They were the consequences of repeated, calculated cruelty. And as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, it became undeniable. Dunn's actions were far from an accident. But the most powerful moment came when Lara's recorded testimony was played in court. Her fragile voice trembled as she recounted the horrors of that night. Though she was too young to fully understand the significance of what she was sharing, her words carried a weight that no legal argument could erase. She was the voice of the victims, a survivor who had witnessed unspeakable horrors and was now forced to relive them for justice to be served. Her testimony was a gut-wrenching reminder of the trauma that would never leave her and the broken family left to pick up the pieces. In response, Dunn's defense team tried to salvage his reputation. They claimed his actions were a result of stress, personal turmoil, a lapse in judgment. They argued that the man they were now facing in court was not a monster but someone pushed to the brink. But the jury was not swayed. They saw through the defense's attempt to humanize a man who had shown nothing but cruelty. Dunn's history of abuse came under the microscope. His past conviction for child abuse was not a forgotten chapter. It was a glaring, undeniable part of the story. This wasn't just one terrible mistake, it was a pattern, a series of red flags that had been ignored for far too long. The jury, understanding the full scope of his past actions, made their decision with clarity. After days of deliberation, the verdict was handed down, guilty. Jonathan Dunn was convicted of aggravated murder, child abuse, and sexual abuse. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Kler family, though relieved to see justice served, understood that nothing would ever bring back their son. Aleister was gone, and his absence would echo through their lives forever. While the conviction was a step toward justice, it could never undo the damage done. The Kler family's grief was raw, heart-wrenching. Brittany Kler couldn't even imagine the holidays without her son. "I just don't even want to celebrate Christmas this year without him," she said, her words hanging heavy, filled with pain no parent should ever have to experience. For Brittany and Justin, the void left by Aleister's tragic death was immeasurable.
I loved him more than life itself. I'm sorry, now I'm getting emotional.
Brittany Kunzler says she's learning to live with loss.
I don't know if you have any kids, Sarah, but I mean, from one parent to any other parent in the world, he was a good kid. He was a good boy, and
It wasn't just the loss of a child. It was the loss of their future, their dreams, and the essence of what their family was supposed to be. And yet, as devastated as they were, they had no choice but to push forward, if only for Lara, their surviving daughter, who was fighting a battle of her own. Lara, though physically healing, was scarred in ways no doctor could treat. Her road to recovery would be long, fraught with the emotional weight of what she'd survived. She would have to navigate not only the physical scars left by the trauma, but the psychological ones as well. The Kunzlers had to support her, lifting her up from the ashes of this horrific tragedy, even as their hearts were breaking for the son they would never hold again. But the Kler family's grief didn't just stay within the walls of their home. The entire community of Roy, Utah, stepped up in a way that was impossible to ignore. Neighbors who had once shared small talk over backyard fences now found themselves bound by something far deeper: outrage, sorrow, and a collective desire for justice. Vigils were held, candles flickering in the darkness as people gathered to remember Aleister, to stand in solidarity with the Kler family, and to grieve a life stolen far too soon. Fundraisers sprung up almost immediately, with the entire community working together to support the family in any way they could. It wasn't just financial support, it was the emotional comfort that came from knowing that Aleister's story hadn't gone unnoticed, that he hadn't been forgotten. The town wrapped its arms around the Kunzlers, showing them they were not alone in their heartbreak. The questions came fast and hard. How could someone with Jonathan Dunn's history, a violent criminal who had been convicted of abusing a child, ever be trusted around children again? How could a man with a known record of violence slip through the cracks of the justice system, allowed to babysit innocent children as if nothing had happened? It was a glaring failure of oversight, and it demanded action. Child advocacy groups, backed by an outraged public, immediately pushed for reforms. The voices of Aleister and Lara, though silenced by violence, were now being heard in the form of legislation. The demand was clear: we can't let this happen again. The system needed to be fixed. Stricter background checks, mandatory mental health evaluations, and follow-up therapy for those with a history of child abuse were all at the top of the list. Too many children had been put at risk because of an outdated, broken system that failed to track and monitor dangerous individuals once they had been released from prison. The cost of that failure was far too high, And now, the Kler family's pain was driving the fight for justice. Lara's journey to recovery was never going to be quick or easy. In the aftermath of the horrific abuse she survived, she faced not just the physical scars left by the brutal attacks, but the invisible wounds that cut even deeper. Her body bore the marks of violence, multiple surgeries to repair the damage, physical therapy sessions that stretched over months, each one a painful reminder of the night her life had been shattered. But even as her body healed, it became painfully clear that her mind, her spirit, needed just as much, if not more, care. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, gripped her like a vice, a constant companion she couldn't shake. At just 2 years old, Lara was now fighting battles no child should ever have to face. Nightmares, flashbacks, and an overwhelming sense of fear became part of her everyday existence. She was a little girl, but she had seen and felt horrors that no one should ever endure, and the emotional weight was heavy. Every moment was a struggle, and the trauma took its toll not just on Lara, but on those who loved her the most. But even in the darkest moments, Lara was never alone. She had her family, her mother, Brittany Kunzler, and her father, Justin Kunzler, who refused to let her fight alone. They were there with her every step of the way, helping her navigate this long, painful journey. They provided her with the love and care that she needed to start the slow process of healing. Every hug, every kind word, and every moment of tenderness became a stepping stone on her path to recovery. But it wasn't just her immediate family that stood by her side. The Kunzler family's tragic ordeal sparked questions that shook the very foundation of the justice system. How could Jonathan Dunn, a convicted child abuser, ever be trusted again? And how did the system let him slip through the cracks to babysit innocent children? When we think about cases like this, we often imagine the horror of a single, isolated act. But the truth is, for many children, the dangers lie in the hands of people who have been given a second chance, people who've committed horrific crimes before but are allowed to walk free, and in some cases even continue caring for children. Statistically, the situation is worse than we might think. One study of over 285,000 child abuse offenders found that 15% of these perpetrators reoffended against the same victim, while 12% went on to harm new victims. This means that, for many children, the threat of abuse isn't a one-time occurrence. It's a cycle that can repeat itself unless the system steps in and acts decisively. Now consider this: children with a parent who has a criminal conviction are at a far greater risk of being re-victimized. In fact, research shows that 63% of children whose fathers had a criminal conviction were convicted themselves by the time they turned 32, compared to just 30% of children without a convicted parent. This tells us that the cycle of abuse and criminal behavior doesn't just end with one generation. It often extends through families, creating a ripple effect of trauma and harm that continues for years. These numbers aren't just statistics. They are the foundation for why advocacy for child protection and reform is absolutely critical. Every day we allow people with a criminal history of child abuse to slip through the cracks. We risk another child falling victim. And that's why the Kler family's advocacy, their fight for stricter background checks, mandatory mental health evaluations, and ongoing monitoring of caregivers, isn't just important, it's necessary. Without these reforms, we're essentially rolling the dice with the safety of every child that comes into contact with these individuals. Imagine how many lives could be saved, how many children could be protected if we simply tightened the system, held people accountable, and ensured that those with a history of abuse couldn't gain access to vulnerable children ever again. The tragic story of Aleister and Lara Kunzler serves as a stark reminder of what happens when that system fails. It's time we change the narrative, because no child should ever have to endure the horrors of abuse, especially when we could have prevented it. This isn't just about making a change, it's about saving lives, and it starts with us. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you think enough is being done to protect our children from those who should never be trusted? Let me know in the comments below. If this story moved you, There are more cases on this channel that bring to light the tragedies that demand our attention and action. Stories like Aleister and Lara's shouldn't be forgotten. Be sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video to honor their memory and raise awareness about the dangers that still lurk. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.